All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD1000 Web Development Technologies course, I'm doing a series of video presentations based on the PowerPoint slides for one of the textbooks for the class, and that's Murox, JavaScript, and jQuery 4th edition. I am in Chapter 4, and we've gone through the use of objects and the use of functions, but now we're going to get into events and two illustrative applications. I guess we have to finish up first with our functions. We'll do that first. Whoops, sorry. There we go. All right. So this is the syntax for a function, and I showed you that. I even showed you parameters, but I didn't pass any in, but I used them in here. Here's a function with no parameters. It's called showYear, which just grabs the year, and you got to call it. Very similar to what I showed you. Here's a function that has a parameter. So when you call this function, so when we're calling this right here, this email1, that gets passed into here, and that becomes selector. So rather than typing document.querySelector with email1, we only need the $sign. Email1. Okay? A little bit of a shortcut or an alias, whatever you want to call it. There's a function up on top there that has two parameters. So it has two things passed into it, a subtotal and a tax rate. Functions can have nothing passed into them, one thing passed into them, or any number of things passed into them. Functions can only return 0 values or 1 value. Now that one value can be an array with a million different elements in it. That's okay, but it's just one array. So a function can return 0 or 1 value or one thing. You can also have function expressions. Now, in many ways, JavaScript is unique like this because it allows you to use a function as a variable. So you can grab a function and you can assign a function to a variable. And here's an example of that. Now it runs the same way that what you saw here before. Functions showYear, all right? But now, here when we did it, the name of the function is showYear. And when we're doing it here, the name of the variable is showYear. But it works the same way. This function is actually called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. We're assigning the result to a variable, but the function itself does not have a name. Now, the stuff that you're seeing in here, and we saw an example of this earlier, this is the first time we're looking through here, and we're starting to talk about something called the DOM. DOM is short for Document Object Model. So this is designed to return a value, and it'll return, in this case, the value of email1. Here's a function, as it says, with two parameters that returns a value. You have to make sure the function won't do a doggone thing until it's called or invoked. So calling it and invoking it means the same thing. Now, when you look at this, and I just forget about this up here, but what I want you to realize is this line of code right here, this top line, const calculate tax equal function, paren subtotal comma, tax rate, paren curly brace, is exactly the same as the one here. All right? Now, in the first case, this is a function expression. In the second case, this is a fairly new JavaScript feature called an arrow function, sometimes called a fat arrow. It's an equal sign followed by a greater than sign. Has to be in that order. They do the same thing. So what's the advantage of this one versus this one? It's a little bit briefer, more brevity. And depending on how you write the arrow function, it can lead to less lines of code. And they're showing you some examples here. Again, you're just being introduced to this. So if it doesn't totally make sense right now, it's actually to be expected. All right, so here's some terminology regarding functions. All right. Global variables are variables that are defined outside of any function. So if you remember in the example that I went through before, let's see, where are we? This example. All right, number 1 and number 2 are global because they're defined outside of anything. Here we've got do sum, do diff, etc. And we can work with number 1 and number 2 because they're global. This prod is only, it comes to life right here, and it dies when that happens. All right, and the same thing goes for all of these. You can have global variables, you can have global constants. They both are defined outside of any function. It's considered bad practice. You want to at least limit the number of global variables you have. But to create global constants because they don't change is considered acceptable. Okay. All right, there's var and let. We're going to talk about those not right now. So again, a global variable is defined outside of any method or function. A global constant is defined outside of any method or function. So the scope is the entire program, basically. A local variable is defined inside of a method or function. A local constant is defined inside of a method or a function. So in both those cases, their scope, since it's local, is just in the function or method in which they're defined. Something with block scope, rather, is only known within the curly braces that it's defined in. All right, jumping into events. A lot of events, and there's a lot more than what are listed here. Notice that all elements have a click event. So you can click on anything on your screen and make it do whatever it is you want it to do. Buttons have a click event rather. So what happens when you're running a program, for lack of better words, is the program sits there and waits for you to do different things. Those different things that you can do are known as events. JavaScript is an example of what is known as an event-driven programming language. So it sits there and it waits for events to happen. What does it do when those events happen? Whatever you program them to do. All right. So here's an event handler for join list. This means that when the join list function is called, it should print out an alert. This alert. Here we're taking a button, and that button has an ID called submit button, and we're adding an event listener to it that says, when we click the button, we want to call that join list. So that's how to attach an event listener or an event handler, to a click event. Here's how to do one to a double click. So what's different? They almost look the same, except that's click and that's double click. Not only can you add listeners, you can remove them if they're no longer needed. All right. There's also a DOM content loaded event, which basically, again, you're going to learn about this, I believe, starting in the next chapter already, but the DOM is the document object model, and it starts to be created. All right. It starts to be created as soon as I think it's before the web page loads. They're going to find this out in the next chapter. All right, this one would basically, once the DOM is loaded, okay, there'll be a button, and when you click it, it'll basically tell you that the DOM has been loaded. Fine. All of these events have a property and a method associated with them. All right, and it says right there, the property is the current target and the method is prevent default. Let's talk about these in reverse order. If you do an event.prevent default, almost always what you'll be using it on is on a hyperlink or a button. But it's when you click something, if you don't want the default action to happen, you can call the prevent default. And that'll stop the default action from happening. All right. There's also a current target. Let's see if we can talk about those a little bit in here. So as it says, common HTML elements that have default actions. And you can read these. Load, submit, and reset. So here's an HTML form, and as it says, it has a text box. That's the type equal text, and it has a submit button. Okay. And what are we doing in here? Well, we're setting up an event handler, and we're saying if the value of that, whatever that box is for the email is empty, we want to say email is required, and we want to call a prevent default, meaning we don't want it to go on. All right. This is sometimes called event, sometimes called EVT, sometimes just called E. It's the actual event right here. Now, that was an introduction. If that made little to no sense, please don't let it bother you because we're going to hit on it later. All right, here's another miles per gallon program. What's changed? Well, notice we've got like an H1 tag that says the miles per gallon calculator. We've got a label that says miles driven. We've got a label that says gallons used. We've got a label that says miles per gallon. We've got a text box for the miles driven, a text box for the gallons used, and a disabled text box for the miles per gallon. Plus, we've got a button that says calculate MPG. What's different in this example, this doesn't look that different from what we've built before. What's going to be different is here, what's in the JavaScript. Again, this is an alias. This says rather than having to call document.querySelector and pass it something, we only use the $sign and we pass it something. All right. This works almost identically or virtually identically to the examples we've looked at before. And notice this says that once the DOM has been loaded, we want to add the event listener. So when we click the button that's got an ID of calculate, we want to call process entries. There's process entries. All right, and we want to make sure that when the program begins running, we set the focus to whatever the ID has the ID of miles. Then they go through it again, the same kind of thing, but with the email list. Again, that isn't that different. What's different is what's in these last two slides. Again, notice the join list, the click event. We're doing the same types of things we did before. All right. The difference is, as we do those, we're now using DOM-centric type of code and event handlers. So when we click the clear form, we're telling it when the thing with the ID of clear form is clicked, we want to run that routine. All right, so that's pretty much it then for this chapter. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the chapter that we're on, which I think was chapter 4. So when I come back in a couple minutes, we'll talk about how to test and debug an application. Now this will be a shorter chapter. We may very well be able to do that in just one lecture. All right, and I'll be back with that in a couple minutes.